Hello.
Part 4, Thunder Bluff and the Hunter's Rise. Thunder Bluff revealed itself gradually, the way large things revealed themselves to travelers approaching on foot. First as a vertical presence on the horizon that the eye kept returning to before the mind had fully registered what it was seeing. A suggestion of height in a landscape that was otherwise committed to the horizontal. Then, as the distance shortened over the following hours, as form, the great mesa resolving from impression into fact, the sheer cliff faces rising from the plain with the authority of something geological rather than constructed. The structures at the summit visible as interruptions of the skyline. The rope bridges between the separate rises just barely distinguishable at this distance, as the deliberate work of hands, rather than the accident of stone. Then finally as scale. Cairne had seen Thunder Bluff from a distance his whole life. Every clear day in southern Mulgore you could find the mesa on the horizon if you knew the right direction to look. And he had looked often enough that the sight of it had always carried a forward-pointing sense. Not homesickness, since Thunder Bluff had never been his home, but the forward-looking version of the same feeling, the pull toward a place that contained things not yet encountered. He had thought he understood what he was looking at. Standing beneath the lifts, he understood that he had not. The cliff faces were vertical and massive, in a way that the distant silhouette had not communicated. The rock marked with the evidence of geological time, the faces so sheer that the lifts ascending them seemed almost improbable. The mechanical patience of their operation, a small human argument against the indifference of the stone. The smell hit him before any other detail of the city itself. The particular layered complexity of a large inhabited place, wood smoke and cooking, and the mineral sharpness of worked stone, and the animal note of kodos in their pens, and underneath all of it the clean highland wind that swept the mesa top and descended the cliff faces in cool currents that carried the smell of everything the wind had touched on its way down. Torin moved around the lift base with the purposeful ease of people who belonged here, merchants with laden kodos, hunters returning from field work with the settled look of competence confirmed by recent practice, elders in formal dress whose movements had the deliberate gravity of people whose business was important enough to perform slowly, children managing several objectives simultaneously in the way of children everywhere. The lion walked beside Cairne. Not behind him, as he had walked on the road, alongside, the distance between them having closed over the weeks of travel to something that was simply shared space rather than negotiated proximity. His head was level with Cairne's shoulder, and his paws placed themselves on the stone of the lift platform with the same precision they placed themselves on grass and rock and the hard-packed earth of the road, and he regarded the city's base level with the amber-eyed assessment he brought to all new environments. Thorough, unhurried, reaching a working conclusion and filing it. When the lift reached the upper rise and Cairne stepped off, the area underwent a rapid and visible transformation. It did not happen all at once. It moved like a sound through water, the people nearest the lift first, stopping mid-motion, mid-conversation, whatever they had been doing arrested by what their eyes were now delivering. A merchant whose kodo had been loaded, and patient turned the beast's great head to look at the lion, and the kodo regarded the lion with the dignified neutrality of an animal that had reached an age at which most things could be classified as either relevant or not, and having classified the lion as the latter, returned to waiting. Two guards whose hands moved toward their weapons and then stopped, understanding arriving in their faces that this wasn't a threat requiring a response, but something their training hadn't prepared them to name. A group of children at the edge of the upper rise stopped their running entirely. They stood in a cluster at what they collectively determined was the correct distance, staring with the transparent fascination of young creatures who had not yet learned that this kind of staring was supposed to be moderated. One of them, a calf perhaps 4 years old with a piece of flatbread still in her hand, took 2 involuntary steps toward the lion before an older sibling's hand found her shoulder. The lion regarded all of this with the complete serenity of a creature that had long since stopped needing the world's acknowledgement to confirm its own reality. He walked beside Cairne onto the upper rise of Thunder Bluff and looked at the city with the level amber gaze he brought to all assessments, and the city looked back with the collective astonishment of a community that had thought it knew what it knew. Word moved through Thunder Bluff, the way word moved through any community built on genuine familiarity, quickly, accumulating detail with each transmission, arriving at its destinations in a form that was more complete than its origin. By the time Cairne had oriented himself on the upper rise and identified the general direction of the hunter's rise from the layout of structures around him, the word had already travelled. He was looking at one of the wall maps near the lift station when he became aware of someone approaching with the deliberate directness of someone who had somewhere specific to be and had decided to go there without detour. The hunter named Swiftstone was older than Cairne had expected, though he could not have said precisely why he had formed an expectation. He was perhaps 60, built with the particular solidity that came not from bulk but from decades of physical work that had compressed and settled everything, muscle onto bone, experience into instinct, patience into structure. His face was weathered in the way of someone who had spent most of their life outdoors in all conditions, the eyes set in the permanent slight squint of someone who had spent too many years reading distance in bright light. He wore practical leather armor maintained to the standard of someone who used things until they were done and then replaced them, not precious about it, not negligent either. He moved without waste, each step placed with the minimum necessary to cover the distance, nothing added for effect or appearance. He carried a hunter's knife at his belt and a bow across his back, and the air of someone who would be equally capable and equally present, whether standing in this settled urban space or alone in terrain, 3 days from the nearest other person. He stopped in front of Cairne and looked at the lion. Not a glance, not the brief orientation of someone noting a detail. A hunter's look, the full application of trained observation to a significant subject, moving from the lion's paws to his shoulders to his head, to his coat to the way he held himself in this unfamiliar place, each detail adding to a picture forming in real time. Whatever the picture came out as produced in Swiftstone's expression, something that was not quite surprise. Surprise implied unprepared expectation, and Swiftstone did not appear to be someone who experienced many things without some degree of preparation, but was in the family of surprise. The expression of a craftsperson confronting work that exceeded their prior understanding of the category. He looked at Cairne. He said, "You tamed the Rake." Cairne said, "I tamed the lion. I have not named him yet." He said, "His name is the Rake, come with me." The hunter's rise occupied its own separate elevated platform, reached by a bridge from the upper rise, set apart from the main concentration of structures in a way that was both geographic and atmospheric, the separation serving to preserve something in the space that proximity to the city's ordinary daily business might have worn away. The platform was smaller than the main rises and more exposed to the wind, which came across it with the directness of wind that had nothing between itself and its destination, and this gave the space a sense of alertness. A constant low-level reminder that you were at height, that the plain was far below, that the world was larger than whatever was immediately in front of you. Hunter's Hall occupied most of the rise. Its entrance was flanked by carved posts bearing the marks of hunts across generations, and the inside was everything its exterior implied. The accumulated record of a community's serious long-term engagement with their craft, organized in the way such records were organized by people who valued function over display. The smell reached Cairne before he was fully inside. Layered and complex and deeply particular, tanned leather in multiple states of processing, the oil used to maintain bowstrings, dried herbs whose identities he could partially separate and partially not, preserved meat, the mineral sharpness of maintained steel, and underneath all of it the complex animal note of many different species, the ghost of presences that had passed through this space over years and left their traces in the material of the walls. The walls were covered. Pelts of remarkable variety, some familiar, plains animals of Mulgore he could identify at a glance, others that spoke of distant territories or unusual specimens. Mounted antlers of sizes that told stories about their former owners. Maps, multiple maps, different scales and different territories, covered in notations in several different hands, as if they had been passed between users across years and each had added what they knew. Tools he could identify and tools he could not. He had moved toward one of the maps, a large rendering of the barrens and surrounding territories, its notations dense enough to have taken years to accumulate, when he fully registered the hunters already present. Urek Thunderhorn was near the entrance, standing with the ease of someone in a familiar space, his assessment of Cairne direct and professional and reserving judgment. Cairne Thunderhorn was at the far wall with a bow across his knees, looking at the rake with the focused attention of an expert examining something in his field that exceeded his prior reference points. Holt Thunderhorn sat cross-legged on a thick hide near the center of the space, and his expression when he looked at the rake was something Kah had not seen before on the face of an experienced hunter, something close to reverence, held carefully. ASHWALLOW Thunderhorn, who trained the companions of hunters rather than the hunters themselves, stood near the rear of the space and was looking at the rake with the expression of a practitioner encountering something that was going to require her to revise her professional understanding. And at the tent's rear, in a low chair that had clearly been occupied so many times it had developed its own relationship with its occupant's shape, was the hunter Graywind. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that had passed through the conventional markers of age into something simpler. The way ancient stone was simply what it was rather than what the weather had done to it over time. His face had simplified down to the essential over the decades, and his eyes when they found Kah's were the eyes of someone looking at something from a considerable height, with patience and without judgment. He had not spoken yet. He did not need to speak to be the most present thing in the room. The tent went quiet with the specific completeness that space is achieved when multiple people simultaneously chose stillness. And in that stillness, Swiftstone gestured for Kah to sit, and when Kah sat, the rake settled beside him with the naturalness of something that had been doing this for longer than the arrangement had actually existed. Swiftstone sat across from Kah and looked at the lion for a long moment before he spoke. He said the name comes from the way he hunts. Not the strike itself, the preparation before the strike. He moves through terrain the way a rake moves through grass, clearing everything in front of him in a single pass, nothing left standing in his path that was not already going to be standing. The hunters who first saw him work gave him the name before anyone had gotten close enough to count his kills. The name came from the pattern, not the animal. He paused. That was 11 years ago. He has been in the Red Rock country south of the Bloodhoof, grazing lands, since before anyone currently working this hall began working it. He is the oldest confirmed presence in southern Mulgore that we have a continuous record of, not the largest predator in the territory, not the most aggressive, simply the one that has never been displaced, never been challenged successfully, never once been found to carry a mark that another animal put on him. He looked at Kah directly. Every serious hunter in Kalimdor knows the name. Most of them have looked for him at some point, in the way that hunters look for things they need to understand rather than things they intend to take. None of them have sat in his grass. He was quiet for a moment. We did not know if anyone ever would. Swiftstone looked at the lion for another moment. Then he said, "Tell us." Kah told them. He was not a natural storyteller in the performative sense. He did not build toward moments or choose words for their music rather than their accuracy. He told it the way he experienced things, as a sequence of specific observations and the decisions they implied. The smell that had brought him off the path into the Red Rock country. The plain strider still warm. The ridge above. The first sight of the lion. He described the rake as he had actually seen him. The coat, the mane, the face, the complete absence of any mark that spoke of damage sustained and survived, the watching that was ownership rather than vigilance. He described sitting in the grass 30 yards away for the first day, and coming back the second morning and the third. He described the lion's stillness in those first days, the directed component of it, the subtle evidence of awareness within apparent inattention. He described the third morning and the 30-second look. He described the days that followed and the gradual change in the lion's stillness as the directed component reduced, and he moved from being monitored against the territory to being incorporated into it. He described the 14th morning, the stretch, the step down from the ridge, the settling 20 yards away without announcement or drama. He described becoming aware of the presence behind him on the road north, and stopping to check his mother's map, and seeing, peripherally, the lion sitting in the grass 25 yards back. He told it plainly and without embellishment, and the tent stayed quiet throughout. The rake lay with his head on his paws, his amber eyes at half-mast, the picture of an animal completely at rest in an unfamiliar space, which was itself a statement about the bond. When Kah finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be a response in its own right. Then Swiftstone said, quietly and not to Kah but to the tent, the ridge in the Red Rock country, south of the Bloodhoof grazing lands. He paused. The lion with no marks. He looked at the rake for a long moment with something additional in his expression now, not surprise, because Swiftstone did not appear to experience many things unprepared, but a recognition that had weight behind it. The tent was quiet again. Then Graywind spoke for the first time. His voice had the weight of things said by people who say few things, and therefore weight each one accordingly. The beast chose, he said. You simply made yourself worth choosing. The words settled into the tent with the gravity of an accurate naming, not a compliment in the ordinary sense, not praise designed to make the recipient feel good, but the precise identification of what had actually happened and why it mattered. Kah felt the truth of it the way you felt the truth of a diagnosis that explained something you had been experiencing without understanding. He had not tamed the rake. He had not earned the rake through merit or effort or demonstration of worthiness. He had been still and patient and honest enough across sufficient days that the rake had made a free and complete decision. The choosing had belonged entirely to the lion. All Kah had done was make himself the kind of thing worth choosing. He would think about those 7 words for the rest of his life. What followed in the weeks after that first evening was an education of a particular kind, not the education of instruction received and absorbed, but the education of understanding tested and refined against the experience of someone who had been building the same understanding for decades, and had arrived at formulations that years of practice had proven accurate. Swiftstone and the Thunderhorn hunters did not lecture. They demonstrated and observed and asked questions that pointed at things without naming them, leaving the naming to Kah, which meant the names he arrived at were genuinely his own rather than borrowed. They were teaching him to think in a specific way rather than teaching him specific thoughts, and the distinction was the difference between knowledge that could be applied flexibly and knowledge that could only be applied in the circumstances it had been learned for. The fundamental principle of the Beast Master Path, as Kah came to understand it through these weeks, was not a technique but a relationship to a relationship. The bond between a hunter and a companion was not a tool the hunter used. It was a thing that existed between them, that had its own requirements and its own terms and its own integrity, and the hunter's role in it was not management or direction, but the kind of consistent, honest, daily presence that allowed the bond to be what it was capable of being rather than what the hunter wanted it to be. Different animals, Swiftstone told him, carried different knowledge in their bodies, knowledge accumulated through each species' particular history of survival in its own environment, encoded into the way they moved and perceived and responded. This knowledge was not transferable through instruction or imitation, but it was observable if you watched with real attention rather than agenda, and sustained observation of that kind could produce an understanding of the principle underneath it, and that principle, stripped of the specific body that had developed it, could sometimes be transferred to a different body through the patient, consistent communication of a hunter who had understood it deeply enough to translate it. This was the work he had been doing in Bloodhoof village with the prairie wolf and the boar. He understood now, building the raw material for the translation work that Thunder Bluff was teaching him to do properly. He had spent time with a prairie wolf and a boar in the Bloodhoof village area in the months before his departure, taming each briefly, observing what each carried, releasing each when the observation was complete. The prairie wolf moved differently from anything he had observed before. The low initial approach, the body staying close to the ground, the specific way momentum was managed through rapid changes of direction that were too tight for anything larger to follow. He had spent 2 weeks with the animal, fighting beside it, watching it, learning the vocabulary of its movement with the patient attention he gave to things worth understanding. Then he had released it, because the thing he had needed from the encounter was the understanding rather than the animal itself. The boar he had found in the hill country north of Bloodhoof village, and had tamed in an afternoon with the directness of someone who had already done this once and knew the shape of the process. The boar's knowledge was different from the prairie wolf's, less about movement and more about force management, the specific techniques of an animal whose primary defensive strategy was to be harder to stop than the thing trying to stop it. He had spent 10 days with the boar, learning its approach to engagement with the same attention. He had released the boar on the road north, and arrived in Thunder Bluff with 2 animals worth of understanding that he was now, under Swiftstone's guidance, learning to translate into the specific language of the Rake's body and capabilities. The evenings at the fire outside Hunter's Hall were the working sessions. Cairne would describe what he had observed, the prairie wolf's angular approach principle, the boar's force management approach, and Swiftstone or Graywind or one of the Thunderhorns would ask questions that refined his description toward the principle underneath the technique. And then Cairne would work with the Rake, communicating not the prairie wolf's movement or the boar's force management, but the underlying understanding that had produced each. Finding the lion's body version of each principle through patient repetition, and the attention that the Rake had long since learned to recognize as the signal that something was being offered rather than demanded. The lion's response was always the same, a period of apparent indifference that was not indifference but consideration, conducted in whatever process the Rake used for consideration, and then a morning when something had quietly changed. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Simply the evidence, in the way he moved in the next engagement, that something had been received and integrated and made entirely his own. Watching this happen was, Cairne thought, among the most absorbing things he had encountered in a life that was becoming usefully full of things worth watching closely. The middle rise reached him on the morning of his 5th day through the smell. He had been crossing the bridge from the upper rise when it arrived, the complex, specific, deeply inhabited smell of a serious leatherworking operation, tannin and fat, and the sharpness of curing agents, and underneath all of it the base note of hides in various states of processing. A smell that communicated more about the scale and seriousness of the work than any visual assessment could have done from outside. He followed it to the Thunder Bluff armorers with the instinct of someone who recognized the smell of a place where his craft was taken seriously. Una looked at his hands before she looked at his face. She was not young. Her hands carried the accumulated record of decades of intimate daily contact with leather, the skin darker at the knuckles and fingertips where the work had left itself, the fingers precise and strong in the way of hands that had done the same skilled thing so many times that the skill had moved below the level of conscious direction. She worked at a bench in the interior of the main space, surrounded by hides in various states of completion, and she assessed Cairne's arrival with the unhurried attention of someone who had seen every level of incoming ability and had long since stopped being either impressed or discouraged before she had the evidence. She placed a prepared hide in front of him and said, "Show me." He worked it the way his mother had taught him, carefully, attending to grain direction and tension, feeling for the resistance and yielding that indicated correct technique. He was aware of being watched with the completeness of genuine expert attention, the kind of observation that went past what he was doing to read what his hands knew, and what they did not know, and what they believed they knew but had wrong. When he finished, Una looked at the piece the way she looked at everything, reading it rather than simply seeing it. Then she identified 4 things, each precise, each correct, each a gap in his technique that he had not known was there. She said them without judgment, information, delivered at the temperature of fact, and then picked up the hide and demonstrated each correction with hands that moved through the material with a fluency that was genuinely beautiful to observe. The fluency of someone who had passed so far beyond technique that what remained was something that had no adequate name except mastery. Moranta, who trained the skinning work from the same space, looked at his existing technique with the direct eye of someone whose field was acquiring the raw material her colleague processed. She gave him 3 corrections and demonstrated each with the efficiency of someone who had been making these same corrections in students for long enough that the demonstration was entirely automatic. He came back every morning for 3 weeks. Una gave him new materials as his technique developed, hides from animals he had not worked before, each one a new problem that his developing vocabulary allowed him to approach with increasing confidence. She showed him the relationship between temperature and humidity and the curing process, the way the same material handled differently under different conditions, the patient understanding of variables that separated the craftsperson who produced consistent work from the craftsperson who produced occasional work. On the last morning of his formal time with her, she looked at the piece he had finished and held it in her hands for a moment. "Do not confuse progress with arrival," she said. Then she set it down and returned to her own work, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The spirit rise was reached by bridge from the central mesa, and crossing it gave a view of the full mesa that Kah had not found from any other angle. The rises and the bridges and the structures of Thunder Bluff spread below and beside him in the morning light, the whole complex of the city laid out with the clarity that elevation provided. He stood on the bridge for several minutes and read it, adding this perspective to his understanding of how the city was organized and what it was organized around. The spirit rise was different from the other rises. The sounds of the practical city, the work sounds, the trading voices, the general industry of a large active community, were present but at a remove, softened by distance and by something harder to name, some property of the space itself that invited a lower register. The pools of vision occupied the rise's center, their dark water holding the morning sky without reflection, and the structures surrounding them, the Hall of Spirits, the spiritual healing lodge, the spaces where the priests and shamans trained, had the specific atmosphere of places that took the invisible seriously. Pan Stonebinder worked from the spiritual healing lodge near the rise's eastern edge. Kah understood her organization before he understood anything else about her. The way the lodge's interior was arranged communicated everything necessary about the practitioner who had arranged it. Not order for its own sake, but the specific discipline of someone who had imagined every possible emergency and placed every item where it needed to be findable in poor light, with occupied hands, under conditions that did not allow for searching. The organization was the product of real consequences for failure, laid out in advance. She assessed his existing knowledge on the first day the way Una had assessed his leatherworking, through demonstration rather than description, asking him to show rather than tell. She watched with the calibrated attention of someone measuring not just competence, but the understanding beneath the competence. When he finished, she said, "Your mother taught you the priorities correctly. Stop the bleeding first, then clean, then close, then stabilize. Most people learn it wrong. They go to what looks most urgent, which is not always what saves the life." She understood the sequence. She asked about his mother with the genuine interest of a practitioner, recognizing another practitioner's work. He told her about Sira's methods, the dead planestrider, the specific materials, the making of his hands know the sequence without his mind directing it. Pand listened and said, she understood that skill must live in the body. The mind panics. The body, if it has been properly taught, does what it has been taught regardless of what the mind is doing at the time. This became the organizing principle of everything she taught him in the weeks that followed, the movement of knowledge from conscious to automatic through repetition, that was not mindless but deeply intentional. Each repetition slightly different, requiring adaptation, gradually building a flexible competence rather than a rigid one. She taught him triage, the discipline of rapid, accurate assessment under conditions that did not allow extended deliberation, the ability to evaluate multiple casualties simultaneously and prioritize correctly when the consequence of incorrect prioritization was measured in lives. She taught this through constructed scenarios, and then reviewed his decisions afterward with the same precise, unhurried accuracy she brought to everything. One afternoon, working through the management of serious chest wounds, she looked at him across the work surface and said, "You do not become frightened when the material is serious. Most students have a kind of internal distress with difficult material. It affects the hands. You become more focused. There is not room for distress," he said. "The serious material requires more attention. The attention fills the space." She considered this. "That is useful," she said. "Do not assume it will always be available. There will be situations that exceed your preparation. Know that and plan for it." He filed this alongside everything else she gave him, in the careful arrangement he maintained for knowledge he intended to keep. The high rise was the literal summit of Thunder Bluff Central Mesa, the uppermost platform, exposed to the full sweep of the highland wind, and offering views of the Mulgore Plains in every direction that made height feel less like elevation and more like a different kind of ground, one that existed at the level of the sky rather than the earth. In the mornings, before the day's warmth built, the wind here had a character the lower rises were sheltered from, and the light arrived earlier and fuller, without the softening that the cliff faces provided below. Aska Mistrunner ran Aska's kitchen from the northern section of the high, rise with an ease that came from doing this for so long the organizing had become invisible. The kitchen built around the demands of serious field-applicable cooking, rather than the convenience of the cook. She smelled of wood smoke and rendered fat, and the particular complex note of spices used with genuine knowledge of their effects. And she looked at Cairne's interest in her work with the direct assessment of a professional encountering a student who was approaching the craft with the right kind of seriousness. She taught him not recipes but principles. The caloric architecture of field rations, how much of what combination sustained what kind of physical work over what duration. The specific preparations that produced effects beyond basic sustenance. A meal that clarified the senses for a morning's tracking. A combination that sustained hard physical work in cold conditions longer than the caloric content alone should have allowed. Preparations that helped a wounded body direct its resources toward repair rather than maintenance. What you put in is what comes out, she told him. This is as true for a body as for a hide. Feed it correctly and it performs correctly. Feed it what is available without consideration, and it performs at the level of what is available. He had already understood this in principle from Rake's instruction in Camp Rake. Aska and Mistrunner gave him the advanced version of the same principle, more specific, more applicable to the field conditions he was heading toward, more grounded in the actual physiology of sustained physical work under demanding conditions. Kah Mistrunner ran mountaintop bait and tackle from the high rise's western edge with the unhurried competence of someone who had fished from this exact spot for longer than most of his customers had been fishing anywhere. The shop occupied the optimal position on the mesa for the purpose, the highest fishing location, where the wind moved the water in ways the lower positions did not experience, and where the light fell on the surface differently, revealing what lay beneath with a clarity that the angles available at lower elevations did not provide. He looked at Cairne's equipment and technique, and made 3 adjustments without asking, explaining each with the restraint of someone who considered explanation a courtesy extended to the student rather than a necessary component of the correction itself. Then he sat at his own position and began fishing, and Cairne sat beside him and fished, and the instruction that followed was primarily the instruction of proximity to genuine expertise, watching someone do something very well at close range, which was a form of teaching that had no verbal equivalent. The high-rise water is different, Kah said after a while. The altitude, the exposure, the fish here have adapted to conditions that change faster than the conditions in most water. You have to read them faster. The window for each decision is shorter. Cairne adjusted. The water vocabulary he had been building since the rivers near Camp Rake expanded significantly at mountaintop bait and tackle, adding a new dialect to the language he had been developing. Faster, more demanding, the fish less forgiving of hesitation. It was on a morning in his 4th week, in the hour before the high rise had filled with the day's activity, that Cairne Bloodhoof came to the fishing spot. Cairne had known something significant was approaching before he identified what it was. The birds on the high rise's western edge had adjusted their routine with the specific adjustment that indicated something important moving through their space, and then the sound reached him. A steady rhythm on stone, the butt of the Bloodhoof rune spear striking the high-rise platform with the consistency of something that had been making this sound on these morning walks for as long as anyone currently living could fully account for. Cairne Bloodhoof was not a small presence. He was ancient in the way of warriors, the weight of his years visible not as diminishment but as accumulation, the way stone accumulated weathering without becoming less stone. He was enormous even by Tauran standards, the breadth of his shoulders carrying decades of the specific density that sustained serious physical work produced, and he moved through the high rise in the pre-dawn with the proprietary ease of someone who had known this place longer than the structures on it had existed. He carried the rune spear not as a weapon, not at this hour, not on this walk, but as a walking staff, its carved surface worn smooth by decades of use, and the rhythm of it on the stone felt as natural and inevitable as the wind. He had been briefed. Cairne understood this in the moment Cairne's approach made it clear this was not a chance encounter. The deliberateness of the path, the direction of it, the early hour at which a high chieftain who had other demands on his time had chosen to arrive at a fishing spot. The Hunters' Rise elders had spoken to him. Others had spoken to him. Cairne Bloodhoof had decided to see for himself what the reports described. which was a different thing from being told about it. And he had come at the hour when Cairne was reliably here and reliably alone, except for the lion. He stopped at the edge of the fishing area and looked at the rake for a long time, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing significant things. Warriors, decisions, the character of the people who brought him information, and who brought to this assessment the same attention he brought to all significant things. The assessment was unhurried and complete, and the rake received it with the level amber regard he brought to all assessments, neither performing ease nor showing unease, simply present in himself in the way he was always present in himself. Cairne looked at the coat, the deep tawny, the full dark mane, the sheen of genuine health. He looked at the way the lion held himself in this elevated urban space, as if the space had been arranged to accommodate him rather than the other way around. He looked at the absence of marks on the coat and understood what the absence communicated. "He is not tame," Cairne said. His voice had the weight of things said by people who have been saying important things for a very long time and have stripped everything unnecessary from the saying. "No," Cairne said. Cairne looked at the lion for another moment. "Good," he said. The word carried weight. A tame lion is a lion diminished. What walks beside you has not been diminished. He fell quiet for a moment, looking at the plains below the high rise, the mulgore grassland catching the pre-dawn light, the distances visible from this height making the world look like a map of itself. "I have been High Chieftain of the Tauren since before you were born," he said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a fact of the landscape rather than a biographical detail. "I have watched many hunters come to Thunder Bluff with companions." He paused. "Most of them come with animals they have managed into a functional relationship. Some come with animals they have genuinely befriended." He looked at Cairne with the directness of someone who had decided that the available time was too limited for the circuitous approaches that younger people used when they wanted to say something directly. Very few come with animals who have chosen them. The difference is visible to anyone who knows what to look for. He looked at the rake one more time. "Swiftstone saw it," he said. "I see it." He looked at Cairne. "The lion sees it, which is the only assessment that matters." Cairne received this with the quiet that he brought to things delivered by people who meant exactly what they said. "What is your name?" Cairne asked. "Cairne ASHWALLOW, of Camp Narake." Cairne paused for a moment. "ASHWALLOW," he said, and the name carried the recognition of something already known rather than encountered for the first time. "The Ash Hollow Healers. An old name." He looked at Cairne's hands, the leatherworker's hands, the first aid practitioner's hands, with the look of someone confirming a connection he had already made. He nodded once slowly, with the weight of someone acknowledging something real. He looked at the plains for a moment longer. Then he said, "Walk with purpose, Cairne ASHWALLOW, and listen to your lion." Then he continued his morning walk, the rune spear striking the stone of the high rise in its steady rhythm, moving away toward the far edge of the platform and the view of the eastern plains. And the dawn continued its work on the mulgore grassland, and Cairne sat at the fishing spot with the rod in his hands, and what had just been said settling into him with the specific gravity of words delivered by someone for whom words were not casual. He told Swiftstone that evening in Hunter's Hall, sitting at the fire after the others had gone. Swiftstone listened without interrupting. When Cairne finished, he let a moment pass, looking at the fire. "He does not speak to many," Swiftstone said. "He is quiet," Cairne said. Swiftstone looked at him. "He is the High Chieftain of the United Tauren Tribes," he said. "He is quiet in the way that mountains are quiet." He looked back at the fire. When he speaks to someone, it is because he has decided they are worth speaking to. He paused, and because he has decided the thing he is going to say is worth the saying. Cairne sat with this for a while. Then he knew about the rake before he came. "Yes," Swiftstone said. He knew. He came to see for himself rather than rely on what he had been told, which is how he has made every significant decision for as long as anyone can remember. Cairne looked at the fire. He thought about what Cairne had said, "Walk with purpose, listen to your lion." He thought about the weight of the saying, the specific weight of each word, the absence of anything that did not need to be there. He thought about this for a long time that night. The weeks became months. The season turned from the spring of his arrival through a full summer, the Mulgore plains below the mesa cycling through their full summer richness, the grass at its deepest green, the heat building in the afternoons, which the high-rise wind partially mediated and the lower rise did not, and into the beginning of autumn, when the light went from the hard direct gold of high summer to the richer, more horizontal gold of the changing season, touching the red stone formations of the plains below the mesa with a warmth that made them look briefly like fire. He continued his work with Una and Moranta, and with Pan Stonebinder, and with Aska Mistrunner and Kah Mistrunner, and the work deepened in the way that genuine work deepened under sustained, serious attention. His leatherworking moved past the corrections Una had identified into territory she had not had to correct, the developing of his own judgment about materials and process that was the evidence of understanding rather than technique. His first aid moved past the foundational into the specific and demanding knowledge that Pan had given him, his hands knowing the triage sequence without direction, the assessment of complex situations becoming faster and more accurate. He earned silver while he was in the city, because the crafts produced work that found buyers. Una's assessment of his leatherwork had been accurate enough that the pieces he produced beyond his own needs sold at the armourers to travellers who needed reliable field equipment, and Aska Mistrunner had twice asked him to produce specific preparations for clients who needed field rations for extended ranging work. He spent the silver on the learning that the city provided, and on the specific materials that his advancing leatherwork required, and kept a careful account of both sides of the ledger, because the account was itself a form of knowledge. The practical understanding of how a travelling craftsperson sustained themselves in a world that required continuous investment in capability. He worked with the Rake in the evenings outside Hunter's Hall, and the Rake continued the process of becoming more completely himself, incorporating what was offered from the prairie wolf and the boar work, integrating it into the lion's own movement vocabulary, producing something that was not an imitation of either, but was recognizably informed by both, recognizably more complete than what had existed before. On a late autumn evening, when the fire outside Hunter's Hall was larger than the summer fires had needed to be, and the wind had the bite of air that had been somewhere colder before it arrived, Kah sat with Swiftstone and Graywind after the others had gone. They had reached the kind of understanding that did not require speech to maintain, the understanding of people who had spent sufficient time in each other's company in conditions that revealed character, and had found the character revealed to be trustworthy, and had arrived at the comfortable knowledge of that trustworthiness without needing to announce it. The fire made its sounds. The Mulgore plains were dark below the mesa, visible as the darker darkness beyond the cliff edge, occasional lights from distant settlements marking the terrain with the sparse punctuation of inhabited land. Graywind spoke eventually. In the way he spoke, one thing precisely waited after sufficient silence. "He will have opinions," he said. He meant the road ahead, or the Rake, or both. The ambiguity felt deliberate, as if the distinction between the two was less important than the instruction they shared. Kah looked at the lion, who was watching the fire with the amber-eyed attention he gave to things that warranted watching. "I know," Kah said. Graywind nodded once, with the finality of someone who had said the necessary thing and considered the subject closed. He returned to looking at the fire. Swiftstone looked at Kah for a moment. Then he said, "Come back through when the road has given you something worth bringing back." It was not a farewell exactly. It was a statement of expectation, the kind that trusted the person it was addressed to without requiring them to confirm the trust. Kah said, "I will." He left Thunder Bluff in the early morning of the following day, before the city had fully woken, carrying the particular feeling of someone who had taken everything a place had to offer and understood that the taking was complete. He descended the lift with the Rake beside him, and the Mulgore plains spread below and ahead in the morning light. South toward the barrens and east toward everything he had not yet encountered, the distances made visible by the altitude he was descending from. He watched the plains as the lift descended, the familiar landscape of his childhood made unfamiliar by height and by the simple fact of leaving rather than arriving. At the base of the lift, he turned east. The barrens waited. The crossroads waited, with its notice board and its contracts, and its travelers who might have memory of a scout on the Eastern Road 15 years ago. The road waited in the way roads waited, without urgency and without impatience, simply there, extending toward whatever it extended toward, offering the next thing to whoever arrived at it ready to receive the next thing. He walked east, and the Rake walked beside him, and Thunder Bluff receded behind them in the way that places receded when you were carrying them with you rather than leaving them behind. From the thoughts of Cairne ASHWALLOW.
Graywind said, "The beast chose. You simply made yourself worth choosing." I have been turning this over since he said it, in the mornings before the city wakes and in the evenings at the fire, and I keep arriving at the same place. The word simply is doing more work in that sentence than it appears to be doing. Simply made yourself worth choosing. As if it were a small thing. As if the work of being consistently what you are, across sufficient days, without agenda and without performance, and without the comfort of knowing whether the patience will be rewarded, as if that were simple. It is the hardest thing I know how to do. It is harder than the gun work, and harder than the axe, and harder than anything Stonebinder put in front of me in the spiritual healing lodge. Because the gun work and the axe and the first aid all have external feedback. The shot either goes where you aimed it or it does not, and the not going tells you something specific about what to correct. The work of being worth choosing has no external feedback. You do not know whether it is working. You continue because it is right to continue, and because continuing is itself the point, and because the moment you begin to perform the continuing rather than simply continue it, the thing you were building dissolves. Cairne said, "Walk with purpose and listen to your lion." I have been thinking about purpose, not as a destination. I am not certain I have a destination precisely, and I am not certain I need one. But as a way of movement. The difference between moving towards something and moving through something. I think Cairne meant both, which is why he put purpose and the lion in the same instruction. The lion is purpose made visible, a creature that moves through the world with the complete and unambiguous expression of what it is, without the modifications and adjustments that purpose sometimes requires of those who have to negotiate with other kinds of purpose in shared spaces. I am trying to learn that from him. I think this is one of the things he came to teach me, without either of us knowing it was a lesson. Una said, "Do not confuse progress with arrival." I understand this better now than I did when she said it. Progress is the daily work of becoming more accurately what you are. Arrival would be the completion of that work, which I think is not a thing that happens while you are still alive and paying attention. The confusing of the two is the mistake of someone who wants the work to end, which means they have been doing it as a means to something else rather than as the thing itself. The crossroads. Graywind said the crossroads was where answers might be findable if I ask the right people. I am going to ask. I do not know what I will find. I know that I will keep asking. Cairne ASHWALLOW.